Hello to all of you fathers that are walked all over, and to the mothers that have severe daddy issues, and welcome to my review of Rick and Morty Season 3. Here is my rating system. You may or may not find it stupid, I kind of do, but I also felt like a rating system was a good easy way to sum up my thoughts. At least I'm rating things out of shoes this time, because shoes are completely unrelated and it doesn't really make much sense to rate things out of shoes, and ultimately it doesn't matter, you can ignore the shoe part. Anyway, let's jump into Rick and Morty Season 3. The Rick Shank Rick Redemption completes the cliffhanger that Season 2 ended on. I don't think there's ever been an episode of a cartoon that I've seen this hyped up. Sure, there was the Gravity Falls final, but I feel like even that had a smaller audience. The Gravity Falls audience was pretty much all there for the final. Rick and Morty's audience built up in between Season 2 and 3, and it was freaking insane. I remember seeing their Facebook page be well under 100,000 likes to quickly go over 1 million in the break. The only other episode of a cartoon I can think of that would be close is Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 2, but the internet back then wasn't the thing it is today. So I really think, at least in my mind, there isn't a cartoon episode that comes close to this level of hype. Obviously, with this hype would come a ton of cheers, a ton of tears, and a ton of disappointment. The episode starts with a massive troll moment trying to make the audience think that Rick got out of prison off screen. I called it out on its bullshit, but still thought it was pretty damn funny. The Galactic Federation has control over the family, and the one that's doing best is Jerry because he's a worm. Rick doesn't just break out of prison using a mind swapper device. By the way, this is one of the shows that's best done that, since it didn't say some miracle voice change happened. It's minor, but they make sure the same body has the same voice box. It just happens it's mostly other Ricks he travels into. Even then though, I still don't think it reached the full potential of the mind swapper. But he also takes down the Citadel of Ricks, and causes the Galactic Federation to leave Earth. There's so much here for the plot, it's just so fast paced. We see Morty that's absolutely sick of Rick's shit, a crazy Summer, a broken down Beth, and a successful Jerry. Summer trying to help Rick does come across as sort of strange sometimes, but believable enough to work for the plot. We even get Cronenberg universe back and a fake Rick backstory. This is unbelievably packed tight with content. Despite being packed tight, I don't think it's perfect. This works as a continuation for the previous episode, and in many ways, I'll admit, is much better. However, one thing I definitely am disappointed by is that the wedding squanches ended with a sad giving up tone, and that definitely doesn't continue across with the Rick side. It felt kind of manipulative, and I don't think it was intentionally trying to be. I think they just wanted a different, more grand feeling tone for this episode. Rick's so smart, it just feels like a game to him. Honestly, that's my only real problem with the plot. I just wish we could have gotten a minute of seeing a defeated Rick, maybe instead of that troll moment to make it fit. After all, there were other trolls in this season and even this episode. The biggest troll and one of the funniest things about this episode isn't even in this episode. And that's because it aired on April Fool's Day. Almost nobody was sure if it was actually out. I know that I sure as hell wasn't. There was a downside, which, if I remember it correctly, it caused a Samurai Jack episode to be delayed with no notice. There are some funny things, but it's kept to a minimal just because of how much had to be stuffed into this. I feel like it should have been given an extra 30 seconds or a minute to do that defeated Rick thing I said, but I digress. The funniest moment for me was that Morty genuinely went to kill Rick.
Fake gun, shoot me and stand up. Brilliant!
Yeah, good thing I saw that note.
This episode also has the Jerry and Beth divorce. I feel like they should have waited until episode 2 for that, but I get that this episode did want to set up everything for the season to come. Due to this episode not feeling quite right to me as a continuation of that cliffhanger due to its initial tonal shift, I've gotta say I really like this episode instead of love it. It also doesn't have that many funny moments for me. I really like it though. You might even say that I really like it. Rick planting the stone is a weird episode, and not in the usual Rick and Morty way. The episode, for the most part, is a Mad Max parody. The focus, however, is on the characters' reactions to Beth and Jerry's divorce. Rick is how you'd expect him to be. He's fine. He's Rick. He's trying to get a rock that generates a shit ton of power. Summer is the character to get emotional the quickest, and I think this is mostly an episode for her over the other characters. She continues being the crazy, smart and badass self that she became in the premiere of this season. A lot of her story is getting into a relationship with Hemorrhage, Joe McHale, whom you may or may not know from a certain other Dan Harmon show. She then finds out she's more crazy than he is. Morty gets a sentient buff arm that loves to kill and wants revenge on those that killed it and its family. This is easily my favourite plot from the episode. His emotions are released when the arm does the stuff for him. Summer's story is okay. It's watchable. It's good because it develops her, but it just becomes a relationship story early on. Hemorrhage isn't exactly a great one-off character, and I don't really care about Summer. It probably also doesn't help that they take the relationship itself strangely seriously, but the dumbness behind it does help it a bit. Rick's story doesn't really go anywhere you wouldn't expect. He does realise though that he probably can't leave the kids behind in a place they'll probably get killed. The way I'm talking about this episode currently, you probably don't think I like it. Not true. The Morty side is funny and gives pretty good development to his character.
I mean, I know what I'd vote for if you're feeling out the room. You're right. We both gotta see our stuff through. I gotta deal with my parents' divorce, and you gotta, do what you gotta do. I love you. Aw,
The setting is also great, they nail it. The colours, the visuals, and the weirdly sexual way the characters dress. There's also the robot scene in the reality we follow. Summer's robot saying like for what feels like every other word is like good, like. Morty saying his sister died in the spaghetti is one of the typical ridiculous, funny and dark jokes we get.
Coming from a...
Toast my bread in the morning. You just became my backup toaster.
Ah, jeez. My sister died in the spaghetti.
I like how Rick destroys how the way the planet functions by giving them electricity, making them go from badass to gossipy. I do think the Summer side drags down this episode quite a bit. If you were a big fan of her, which I wouldn't understand, but if you were, you might like it. I just think the Morty side made the development funny, which the Summer side failed on. The Rick stuff is always great, even if it feels like he does relatively little. I do find it weird though that Rick is so uncomfortable eating human flesh. Overall, I like the episode. Rick's fun, Morty's fun, but Summer's story felt like it was getting the most focus, even though I didn't count the seconds. It may be because it dragged on so much. I liked the episode overall, and I definitely don't think it's the worst in the series, like a lot of people were saying when it first came out. Pickle Rick is one of the most popular and one of the most well-known episodes from the show. When they showed off the teaser for it in its early stages, I thought it had a good chance of being one of my favourite episodes from the show. It's not. Let's talk about that. The story is that Rick turns himself into a pickle to avoid family therapy. When Morty calls out the bullshit in his experiment, Rick actually has to survive the day as a pickle. This isn't not one of my favourite episodes because of the Pickle Rick meme.
Here's something that's never happened before. I'm a pickle. I'm Pickle Rick!
Memes as a whole make things I like worse by default for me, like when steamed hams was a thing, because I genuinely loved that scene. That's not either of the show's fault though. In fact, I can say I really enjoyed the Pickle Rick side of things. Rick being left in a body where his only ability to move is his mouth and head is a challenge for his character because he has to work his way from the bottom to the top. Sure, the Pickle Rick side of things just involves killing to make his suit, then further killing in the suit, but it's fun throughout. Danny Trejo was a great one-off character, just your typical badass seeking revenge. But it's Danny Trejo. I just like how the pickle side goes for a survival story to killing for the fun of it all. I love the rats battle. It's not one of my favourite moments from the series because it's funny. I do think it's funny though. I mostly like it because of how over the top the violence is. Most shows use smooth animation for minor things, but that scene demanded it, and it used it. I do understand why some hate the Pickle Rick joke. I do think that sums up a lot of Justin Roiland's humour though, basically saying the character's name in a weird voice, and them saying their situation and gimmick.
I turned myself into a pickle, Morty! Boom! Big reveal, I'm a pickle. What do you think about that? I turned myself into a pickle! I'm Pickle Rick!
It could be anything, it doesn't have to be a pickle. The other side of the story I do not like. I'll go as far to say that it's my least favourite plot from all of Rick and Morty, by far. I think that the therapy is a bad way to let the audience in on the characters. I think a lot of the fault in that is that it gives the therapist a lot to say, especially directed at Rick. She's not written to be anything more than a therapist. It just feels like the laziest way to explain each character's depth. Normally, the depth behind characters is hidden in some random plot. but this time the development seems to be taking a centre stage over having a clever plot. I get that it was included to balance the ridiculousness with the Pickle Rick stuff, but it didn't need to be that one, no. If you want a therapy episode done right, then I urge you to watch The Gang Gets Analysed from It's Always Sunny. It shows the dysfunction of the group, having all of the characters ooze with personality.
Well, first of all, through God, all things are possible, so jot that down.
And stop hiding the pigeon.
The pigeon.
This one, let him be who he wants. Let him fly away. Go! You unzip me. It's all coming back. It's all coming back. I hate you. It's all coming back, you understand? I don't like it. I don't like to think about it.
So he has no appetite because you're drugging him, secretly.
Giving a man medicine for his disease. Wherever did I get that idea?
How are you feeling about all of what I'm doing? Did you like that? Did you think that was good? Tell me I'm good. Tell me it was good. Tell me I'm good. Tell me I'm good. Tell me that was good. Tell me I'm good. Tell me I'm good. Tell me I'm good.
And it doesn't rely on the therapist for the whole plot. She just asks usual therapist questions, and it's someone for the gang to bounce off of. I don't feel like the therapist analysing Rick after a little bit of time was justified. It didn't feel like an earned win for her, or a deserved loss for Rick. I think that entire side of the episode should have been scrapped. I really didn't like it. It was played as normal and just occasionally threw in a Pickle Rick or a Poop Eater. I do think a therapy episode could have worked, but it should have been the characters' own dysfunction bouncing off of each other to learn a lesson. I will say, it does do what it aimed to do though. It gave Beth more to do, but most of what was analysed from the characters could have been dissected from previous episodes of the show. We didn't need to be told. It comes across as them thinking the audience is stupid. The end scene with Beth and Rick was better than all of the therapy stuff itself, because while it was giving us a clear view of the characters' faults, it wasn't telling us them. It wasn't a great scene, and I think it made the entire therapy thing feel pointless, since it appears like it was only in there to show how close Rick and Beth's mindsets are. One therapy scene and the car scene would have been sufficient for that, and then they could have given us other stuff instead. I'll stop harping on now. Ultimately, the episode has one plot I can say I really liked, but one I'd consider really bad. The episode is only mediocre. I wasn't really expecting this, but upon rewatch, the Pickle Rick stuff had less substance than I remembered, and the therapy stuff was just as bad as I remembered. It upsets me this is the episode that won the Emmy over other great episodes from the season of the show. Overall, mediocre episode. Vindicators is Dan Harmon's least favourite episode because it doesn't follow his story wheel. Do I think it's the worst? No, it's not even the worst of the season for me. Opinions are opinions. I just mentioned Dan Harmon because I'm interested in hearing other people's opinions. This episode is clearly a statement/satire about all of the Marvel movies, and how there's always a bigger bad. Rick winds up being the biggest bad. In the Marvel movies, the characters tend to get out of scenarios unharmed. For the most part anyway. Not here. Drunk Rick is a force to be reckoned with. The episode quickly goes from being a Marvel parody to a Saw parody. Morty knowing most of Rick's tricks shows clear development for his character, and doesn't feel forced. The heroes were all creative in backstory, design, and personality. The episode is decently funny throughout.
I conceived a child with million ants and it died inside me because it was 500,000 ants and half collapsing star!
And I like how they pulled the rug under the feet of Morty and the audience. Rick was becoming known for having emotional moments connected with Morty, so to have what looks like another one actually be aimed at Noob Noob, a character that's one note, was a smart and funny decision. It defies expectation. The very end with the concert was stupid. I did not like it. Even if it was a reference to anything, it just didn't work for me within the context of this episode. I can't help but feel like something's missing from this episode. And while I don't feel like every episode of every comedy needs to follow a similar structure to Dan's story circle, I do think this episode's pacing of events feels off. I do think they could potentially do a brilliant episode without the circle. That being said, there's not really a reason not to follow it when it holds good results. Justin Roiland's method acting Drunk Rick was dedication, though I'm sure he enjoyed himself. However, I don't think he sounded drunk enough when comparing it to the animation in the end.
You do have one thing that I'll never have, and that thing is the only part of the Vindicators with any value to me. If you know what it is, place it on the platform.
Rick was a little irritating at the beginning. I get he's cynical, but it still irritated me. The episode isn't spectacular, but is creative and a good way of developing Rick and Marty's relationship. It is pretty funny, but the pacing of events feels off. I like this episode. The episode is a Rick and Jerry episode. That, as a concept, I like automatically. The episode has Rick taking Jerry to a planet where Jerry and nobody else can die. The way they show this off is brilliant. Rather than Rick explain it and then get stabbed, he gets stabbed and then after he heals he explains it. Jerry then meets someone that wants to get Rick killed, with Jerry's assistance. This episode gives Rick and Jerry some common ground. Finally, they've been at each other's throats for seasons. We get one clip of them laughing together, one of Rick saying he's genuinely sorry about all of the shit he put Jerry through.
I'm sorry.
What?
I didn't respect your marriage. I certainly didn't do it any favors, and for what it's worth, I'll apologize to Beth for it when we get home.
And him calling him buddy. It goes back to normal because Jerry's a worm, but to see Rick could genuinely be nice for that long is great. Meanwhile, Summer tries to make herself hotter, but she winds up making herself a giant. She looks very Attack on Titan, which is clearly intentional. Not much really happens in this plot, but I still think it's decent. We get moments between Marty and Beth. We've seen everyone other than Marty and Beth as a combo, so it's nice to see. Marty becomes very unlikable at the end, but I do think it's important to show because everyone other than him in the family was unlikable in some way before this. This episode continues to develop Beth to be much like her father, like was shown in Pickle Rick. Definitely prefer the way this episode handled that stuff. The biggest problem with this episode for me is that most of the conflict is between Rick and Jerry, and yet it throws in another villain as a reason for the conflict for Rick and Jerry to begin. The episode quickly drops the whirly-durly and shield, then it goes to survival, but quickly drops that. Then it focuses on the villain it had built up, but he wasn't built up nearly enough. I get that this is a bonding episode, and I'm okay with that. And for the most part, I'm okay with the lack of focus in a certain area, but the villain just felt unnecessary. A thing I wasn't a big fan of with episodes 2 and 3 was how it focused on normal things, with the creativity being left on the side. If this episode was built up to be about one area and then halfway through changed location, I'd have a problem. Instead, the episode is about Rick and Jerry's adventure, and the two of them changing location so much adds to the adventure and to the creativity. My favourite moment in this episode is the one that it is, because of its brilliant setup. We see kids shooting each other and reviving, then the force field goes down. Unbelievably funny, and a pretty dark joke. The animation and style in this episode is phenomenal. The colours, the shadows, the smoothness, the aliens, the whirly-durly, and that sequence of clips. This episode and the season premiere are both absolutely gorgeous for different reasons, and I love that aspect of both of them. Just well done to anyone that works on the show in general, but especially the artist this time around, because these episodes are beautiful. Overall, this episode gave us a great Jerry and Rick bonding episode, and a pretty decent Marty and Beth one, and at the same time a Beth and Summer one. The villain for the main plot felt weak, but the character interactions and journey was great, and the episode was pretty funny throughout. The lack of a consistent sci-fi story though isn't my preference. Overall, I L-I-K-E this episode. I was considering giving it a R-E-A-L-L-Y space L-A-K-E, but I'm not the biggest fan of the B-plot in the world, and the villain felt a bit pointless. Close to a R-E-A-L-L-Y L-I-K-E. Rest and Relaxation is easily one of my favourite Rick and Morty episodes. Does what I want from a Rick and Morty episode. Rick and Morty get burnt out on adventures in a brilliant scene that shows Rick defeated.
Why do you keep doing this to us?
I don't know, Morty. Maybe I hate myself. Maybe I think I deserve to die. I don't know. We need a vacation.
Because of this, they go to a spa that clears their toxins. By clear their toxins, I mean it actually removes the toxic sides to them, causing there to be a non-toxic Rick and Morty and a toxic Rick and Morty. What I love about the concept is that instead of making a definitive good and bad Rick and Morty, the toxic Rick and Morty are the aspects of themselves they consider toxic. Some of those aspects could be considered good. Rick caring about Morty is in toxic Rick. Some aspects are considered neutral. How do I know this? Other than a realistic guess on my side, the fight between toxic Rick and non-toxic Rick is very even. The episode is a Rick and Morty adventure. We barely see Beth or Summer, and we get nothing from Jerry. The show doesn't always have to have everyone. The fight between the Ricks is fantastic all around. It's just so creative, especially with them planting what seems to be a seed for them to grow out of another living organism. I found the episode funny all the way through, from the first scene with Jessica and her friends at the beginning, to the randomness of the Terryfold song, Marty being confident, and my favourite moment, Toxic Marty saying his voice is annoying, and Rick saying that he agrees, and it's his best quality.
While you were flapping your parasitic turd holster, I discovered the toxic equivalent of electricity, Morty. What do you think about that?
I think my voice is annoying.
It is, and it's your best quality.
I normally don't find this show hilarious, but this concept allowed for laugh after laugh. I did find Confident Marty annoying at points, but that adds to the plot of the so-called non-toxic Marty actually having qualities I consider toxic. Even with all that positivity though, if I had one fault with this episode, it'd be the Wolf of Wall Street stuff at the end. It was good, and I do think it would have ended a bit soon when getting rid of Toxic Rick, but that Wall Street stuff does make it drag a tiny bit. This episode helps to give Jessica more of a personality. She's not easy to describe in one word, but that's probably a good thing. She at the very least doesn't mess Marty around for seasons, like how most shows present the love interest for a main character. It's different, which isn't good as a result, but does hold unique potential that we don't often see in other shows. Overall, this is in my top 3 favourite episodes of Rick and Morty. I could probably ramble on for hours for this one episode. It doesn't seem necessary. I love this episode. This was another troll-style episode, in a different way to the premiere though. I didn't know it'd be about the Citadel, but the trailers for this episode felt so basic that I knew there had to be something bigger that wasn't Atlantis. This episode follows the Citadel of Ricks after the stuff that happened in the premiere. It follows a factory worker Rick, a Rick and Morty buddy cop duo inspired by Training Day, 4 Martys going on an adventure parodying Stand By Me, and a political Marty. Wow. If there was any Rick and Morty episode I had to pick out for being ambitious, then it would be this one, by a mile. Somehow this episode balances 4 different stories, all of the stories being interesting, and it still has comedy to spare. I think my favourite story overall is probably the Rick and Morty cops. I was just hooked on every scene. I was hooked on every scene in this episode anyway, but those hooks in particular went so far at me that my favourite joke from this episode is just so well done, it's astonishing. The Factory Rick story starts with the advert, and it ends with the advert.
Daddy!
We captured that moment. We run it on a loop through Simple Rick's mind. And the chemical that makes his brain secrete goes into every Simple Rick Simple Wafer's wafer cookie. Come home to the impossible flavor of your own completion. Come home to Simple Rick's. And in the bargain, he got a taste of real freedom. We captured that taste, and we keep giving it to him so he can give it right back to you in every bite of new Simple Rick Freedom Wafer Selects. Come home to the unique flavor of shattering the grand illusion. Come home to Simple Rick.
But it's that classic dark Rick and Morty humour. The Citadel was already a brilliant concept, but this episode develops the broken down Citadel so well. This is the perfect way to do that. Having 4 different stories and having the audience consistently going in and out of each of them fleshes out this world so well. It doesn't have the same feeling in each story, but that's such a good thing. It shows that the world isn't the same one-note thing. They do all feel like they fit together though. It balances differentiating the tone enough, yet not too much for it to feel weird. The very end with that twist was awesome. It was obvious what it was leading to fairly early on for me, and practically confirmed when the campaign Marty was killed, but that doesn't stop the last scene from giving me goosebumps. It genuinely did give me goosebumps, and I can't say that's a thing a lot of shows have done. There's a lot that I can say about this one, but this one seems almost universally loved, and yep, definitely top 3. I love this episode. Morty's Mind Blowers has Morty recovering the memories he wanted removed in the past. Eventually, Rick and Morty lose their memories and have to rediscover each other through them. This episode definitely feels like this season's replacement for Interdimensional Cable. I wonder what makes me think that. I wonder what possible hint could possibly...
I call them Morty's Mind Blowers. And we'll be doing this instead of Interdimensional Cable.
The episode is less improv-y and instead is a bunch of random stories. Some are big, some are small, but because the episode can play around with their lengths, the episode feels like it gives enough to each story, allowing for plenty of comedy, yet not going on for too long. Along with being the replacement for Interdimensional Cable, this episode is a parody of clip show episodes as a whole. I wonder what possible line could have possibly gave me that hint. I wonder...
It's not a Simpsons Halloween special. More like a clip show made of clips you never saw.
Dan Harmon does clip show episodes right in the sense that it's clips we've never seen. I really don't like clip shows, but I enjoyed this episode and love Community's clip show episode. Along with all of this, Rick and Morty hosted a competition where a fan got to be on the show, and if I remember correctly, they got to pick how they wanted to die. This was the perfect type of episode for that competition to fit. The guy's voice felt like it fit in the world, and if he came up with the scene, then well done, it was pretty funny. Or if it was one of the writers, then well done to them anyway. Rick and Morty having to rediscover each other through memories is great. Them having to go from ridiculous memory to memory is brilliant, because their impressions on each other would change depending on which memories they see first. I don't like the fourth wall breaks the show often does, but I'm at least glad it's often kept to just Rick. This episode, Summer gets one, but it's not directly addressing the audience, but it's not directly said to the audience, but rather it's said to and about Rick and Morty, but there's another meaning behind it for the audience. I don't think that's exactly a fourth wall break, but if a character that isn't Rick has to have a moment that gives the audience a bit of a nudge of, hey, did you get that? The memories are all so creative and so well animated, I think, and don't take my word on this, but I think the storyboard artists were allowed to pick a scene they wanted to do. My favourite clip was probably the alien torture scene. The twist wasn't shockingly funny, but the alien wiggling around with a dumb grin and Rick's end line was hilarious.
He wants to make a deal. Half the code's now, half after you finish.
But can't we trust? Wait, what? Finish what?
You know.
I thought I was torturing him!
Oh, and this disappoints you? Do I tell him we don't have a deal, Morty? Because if we can kill our enemies but we can't jack them off, then how are we better than them?
I'm not a massive fan of every story, but they were all at least decent. I like how there's a massive assortment of variety with the types of humour in the episode. A lot of shows rely on one type of humour above all else, but not Rick and Morty, and not this episode especially. Sure, the show will always have that ridiculousness humour. That comedy just melds well with sci-fi comedies. This episode keeps that ridiculousness, but adds other types of humour on top. Overall, I really like this episode. I'm not a gigantic fan of every story, but they all seem to have a purpose, and the majority I found funny. It's also my third favourite clip show episode of anything, if you can count it as one, even though it's not really, with Total Recall being my second favourite, and Communities being my favourite. The ABCs of Beth is a Beth episode. Finally! Sure, she'd had other episodes, but it was always a B-plot, unless you count the original Interdimensional Cable episode, but I'd call that the B-plot. The episode has Beth and Rick going to Beth's imaginary world that Rick created for her as a child. They go there to find Beth's childhood friend that was left there. Fruipyland is incredibly imaginative, and while the colours are incredibly bright for me personally, that is the point of the world. The creatures are a mixture of bestiality and incest for Tommy to eat. I found Tommy's grossness very funny.
Next item on the docket, I would like to have sex with some of you and then eat the babies. I thought you'd like that. I do keep rolling out the hits, don't I?
I heard people saying this was the most disturbing episode of Rick and Morty because of Tommy's scenes. I don't think so. Sure, there's grossness there, but we don't see him have sex with any of the creatures. The episode is mostly just showing us Beth's personality and how she was raised, and just whether she's a good person or not. She's clearly very Rick-like. She could possibly even be more stubborn. This episode definitely has a lot of issues for me. It has bits that go on for way too long. The play, way too long. And Rick listing toys, way too long. The list was at least creative though. Also, Beth may or may not be a clone. That's a last minute thing. Feels more like a setup for another episode rather than this one. Meanwhile, Jerry has a new alien girlfriend with telekinesis powers that likes to hunt. Jerry clearly isn't interested in being with her for anything other than her body and to get back at Beth. Nothing really feels like it happens in that. It's just Jerry being Jerry, but showing us more of his bad side. I also thought Summer getting him to admit his faults felt really forced. It didn't feel out of character for her, and it wasn't not accurate for Jerry, but something about it felt really off. The Jerry story was just him continuing to be cowardly, but this time in a new relationship. Morty felt unnecessary for the story. Summer is the one that got the important lines. It feels like he was included just because the writers didn't want to get yelled at for not including him. I did like the ending though, where it turned out his girlfriend was already seeing someone else, showing that all alien species are equal, even if they all have their differences. One other line felt off, and it was Rick saying, gross. It was so quick that it didn't sound like Rick. It sounded like Justin Roiland couldn't do it in Rick's voice that quickly.
You're supposed to put elbow grease into your daughter.
Gross.
The highlights of the episode for me, I'd definitely Tommy and the Doodoo Butt song sequence. The episode feels like it suffers due to it clearly wanting to be a development episode. I don't mind characters being well developed, I obviously like that, but in the first 2 seasons Rick was well developed and it didn't feel like it took away from the creativity. Sure, we got Fruipyland, but we also get Rick and Beth just kind of talking. That isn't necessarily bad, but it feels like the potential of Fruipyland was wasted. That could have been fixed for me by cutting down the play, or cutting down the Beth's Toys joke, or even cutting down the B-plot. Fruipyland does end at its most ridiculous point in the story, but it got to that ridiculousness so quickly. Rather than having the characters explore the world, we just get sent straight to Tommy, which as a result took away from Rick's creative creation, and instead made it all about one thing: incest, Muppets. Also, Beth's clone setup felt a little thrown in, but was a good ending to her story, kind of. I think it would have worked more if it wasn't a character we always see. Both the main and B-plot are lacking in humour too. Sure, we have Tommy and the Doodoo Butt scene, and Jerry talking about his girlfriend's avocado-shaped head.
You think it's cool that having sex with her gives me telekinesis, and you recognize she's got a hot bod like Chitara in Thundercats, but you're grossed out by her avocado-shaped head and blue skin, and you think I want to put a bag and a wig on her head.
But Tommy doesn't get that many lines, and the other 2 things are small moments. Overall, I can certainly say I'm not a massive fan of this episode. There are pacing issues for me with those slow scenes. It doesn't feel like we get much from Fruipyland, as a lot of scenes take place outside of that. The Jerry side is very average, didn't have many funny moments for me, and Marty felt pointless. Overall, I think this episode is mediocre. I was considering giving it a like rating, and it was close, but I just have way too many issues with the story this time. The Rick, Chory and Morty date has Rick and the president we first met in Get Swifty having a rivalry after Rick gets sick of helping him. Meanwhile, Beth questions if she's a clone or not. Keith David has a wonderful voice and wonderful comedic timing. He's brilliant in comedies. The rivalry with the president and Rick is really enjoyable. The president's insecurities are made clear throughout. Rick's ego has been made clear for seasons, so seeing them fight each other with power and with intelligence is fun. The fight between them is fantastic visually, even if it doesn't really do much else. I've heard questioning as to why the president doesn't get his own men to do the bidding for him since they have the tech to keep up with some of Rick's inventions. I don't think it's a plot hole. If anything, I think it just says the president is lazy most of the time and shows how little he thinks of Rick and Morty. The episode is funny throughout. I'm a big fan of the bomb line.
Control freak orders drone strikes to cope with
insecurity.
Should we drone strike them? That would prove him right.
And Rick killing a guy that just kind of touched him.
Son, you have a right to refuse his order, and I guarantee you're gonna die if you touch me, and there's no afterlife. Everything just goes black. Don't do it.
Whoa, Rick! Okay, what was that?
Death.
What kind?
Instant.
There was no sound. He just died.
Yeah, terrifying. It's a terrifying thing to watch happen. It's called a deterrent.
The president is great. The rivalry is great. Not much else to say there. Meanwhile, Beth questions whether she's a clone and goes to Jerry. They get back together and the clone stuff isn't resolved well. This plot isn't funny. That said, I thought the moments between Jerry and Beth was nice. It just felt rushed. The season felt like it needed a couple more episodes to show possible clone Beth interacting with Jerry. The first scene we get with possible clone Beth with Jerry is when they get back together. Not funny, but I guess it needed to happen for the end of the season. The Beth clone thing was set up in a way where it felt like it would be around for much longer and be a bigger deal overall. Instead, it just felt rushed. There were good parts to it, but it did feel rushed, and seems like it won't be a big deal next season if the end of the episode is any indication of things to come. Even if it did feel rushed, I hope it doesn't come back, because I think I'd just dislike it at that point. The end of the episode with Rick meeting the family in the middle of the woods felt like a season ending over a this episode ending. It felt like it belonged to an episode that wasn't finished and was stuck on to the end of this episode. The very end of the episode with Beth talking about how the seasons of this show work was irritating. It's promising to look forward to, but I don't like her being the one to get those lines. Rick should be the one getting them, and I don't even like it when Rick gets them. That all being said, Rick starting the season as the highest ranked member of the family only to be dropped to what I consider below Jerry by the family is a brilliant way to end the season. As a concept, I think all of the pieces to this episode worked in some way. It's just it felt like it was pushing a lot of stuff that didn't belong together, and that made the plot weird. There's Rick and the president, Beth being a clone, Beth and Jerry, Marty hiding the family, Rick finding them, and the family all being happy. It's a lot for one episode, and other than Rick and the President, it felt like everything was too quick. This is likely due to the season originally being planned for 14 episodes, but it was likely rushed out due to fans getting all anxious waiting for it. I'd rather have waited a bit longer for a more solid package overall, but that's just me. Overall, this episode is a lot of ideas, with only one I think that truly gets fleshed out. That being said, even the ideas that weren't fleshed out were at least good in parts, and the President story being the majority of the episode makes me say I like this episode. Now let's take a look at the season as a whole. First, the story. Previously, Rick and Marty felt more episodic, while this season tried to add more of an ongoing story arc. I know, characters did develop, but their development didn't feel ongoing, like Beth being a clone as an example. There were minor callbacks like the dead Rick and Marty, but it always felt small. The previous relationship between Jerry and Beth felt like it reset with each episode, even though the characters were evolving. This season it has them being divorced and has the storyline resolved by the end of the season, rather than the episode. The previous seasons may have had overlapping bits here and there, but this season made it more obvious and in your face. This season also felt to me like it was developing the characters over focusing on ridiculous concepts. I do not like this nearly as much. While I do like seeing the developments, I'd rather it be more subtle and feel less connected to the season as a whole. I like the development we got, and that's part of the reason I like this season, but it feels different than the other two seasons, which I can definitely understand people not liking. I also don't think the development itself was always interesting. The development I don't like is when we're being told what's going through a character's mind. I'd rather it be slightly more hidden under actions. I'm okay with it sometimes.
Why would you want this to happen? All you had to do was go away! Stop standing in the driveway talking about custody! And either tell her you want to stay married or get on with your life, but whatever you do, stop being a baby and act like a man!
Oh, a lot of the time it feels like a line or a moment could have been cut. I definitely prefer season 1 and 2 for what its focus was on. That said, this season did have high highs. Rest in Relaxation and the Ricklantis mix-up are two of my favourite episodes from the show, both being incredibly creative and funny and developing the story well. When looking at each episode individually, I guess you could say the season was consistently good, even if I thought some episodes were mediocre. Next, the characters. Rick's focus of this season was being a dick like usual, except this time, him seeing himself as even more like a god. Sure, he did have some nice moments between Jerry and Beth in particular, but this season seemed to dial back how much development he would receive. Not shocking since he was already heavily developed and the writers likely want some surprises left for him to come. This season did give us an episode showing how ridiculously smart he is, and another moment showing us he likely filters out his moments of stupidity in other people's minds due to his own insecurities.
Really makes you think, huh, Morty? We should never take things for granted.
What?
I'm just saying, life's short. We shouldn't take things for granted.
Are you saying granite?
Well, yeah.
It's granted! With a D! Take things for granted! Did you actually think it was... Jesus Christ, Rick! What are you, a boulder rock person? How long have you been saying that wrong?
That said, he was always my favourite part of the previous seasons, partially due to all of the development we got along the way for his character, so I am a little disappointed not to see much new stuff from him. Rest in Relaxation gave us a great look into his mind, though. Morty's main progression as a character through all of the seasons so far is showing him become more and more confident as the series goes along, and even if he isn't getting smarter, he is getting more knowledgeable about Rick and the multiverse as a whole. He got further with Jessica than ever before, and we finally got to see what his and Beth's relationship is like. Summer's development was important as she was already developed heavily in season 2 over season 1, but that wasn't enough as she was still relatively plain. This season shows us how she handles both her parents breaking up and a breakup between her and her boyfriend. Her being a badass seems to be becoming a regular thing. Do need to see how she's written in the next season though, because I'm concerned she'll become a character that becomes whatever the writers want her to be, as there were times I already thought that in this season. Jerry is a relatively simple character, but that's what I like about him. This season portrays him as even more of a punching bag. Sometimes I think it goes a bit too extreme with that aspect of his character.
What? Hello?
The season also portrays him as more of a dick than previously thought, making the punching bag aspect more satisfying for the audience, or me at least. He's finally being a little less cowardly too. I really hope they give him something more redeemable though next season. If one character got more developed than any in this season, it was Beth. Beth in my eyes wasn't really even a character in season 1 and 2. I mean, technically she was. She had a few moments showing us she was similar to Rick in some ways, but most of the time it felt like the writers had her there to explain why Rick was living with them. This season makes it clear just how stubborn and Rick-like she is. It also shows that she's smarter than a normal person, even though we don't get to see much of that. I am glad she was developed this much, but I'm still not a fan of her character, or the episode that really developed her, or the other episode that really developed her. I think Rick and Morty should expand its side cast of characters a bit more. If the show is going to be around for years and years, then I think it needs a bigger cast of side characters to survive. Sure, we have Evil Morty, Mr. Goldenfold, Squanchy and Jessica, but that's not enough. Also, Squanchy didn't appear this season and Bird Person's dead. As previously mentioned, I think the animation in the show keeps improving, and the premiere and the Whirly Durly Conspiracy were particularly great looking to me. Not much else for me to say here, a massive well done to the people behind the animation side of things this time. The humour this season seems reduced, and I think that's because of the more serious tone throughout the characters. I'm not going to act like there weren't plenty of funny moments or episodes, but the humour felt reduced, likely because it felt like the season had a different focus. The first episode had a lot of questions to answer, the second and third were heavily focused on the divorce, and the Beth clone episode had a focus on backstory and development. That said, Rest in Relaxation was hilarious throughout, and Morty's Mind Blowers had comedy be the focus, and was a really funny episode. I don't know if I'm in the minority, but I just didn't find episode 1, 2, 3 or 9 funny a lot of the time. Hopefully the next season goes back to being more dumb fun, now the characters are more fleshed out. Overall, this is a pretty good season of Rick and Morty. It feels very different from the first two seasons, but that isn't always bad. The dumb fun seems reduced and replaced with more serious development, but some of that development, I'll admit, was needed. This is my least favourite season of Rick and Morty to watch as a whole though. I hope the next season goes back to being dumb fun, because even though I like seeing some development, most of the time I'd just rather see some stupid adventures. The end of the season paints a good picture of things to come though. That is all for this massive video. Tell me what you thought of Rick and Morty Season 3 in the comments, and until next time, bye I guess.